mindset control over attitude. The mentally, physically, emotional responsibility that we have to acknowledge the 100% mentally well acknowledgement responsibility. And while we have a responsibility to acknowledge ourselves being mentally, physically, emotionally well, we have therefore the acknowledgement to understand what is the 97.3 percentage calculation educates us in our years. What is the 97.3 calculation that were calculated in accordance to how I walked my human resource office journey, in accordance to my 40-year journey's communication responsibility, in accordance to how I physically, mentally, emotionally, I find myself in these 42 years that forms part of the complete human resource educational office responsibility that I hold, that I have to acknowledge me being health and safety responsibility communication line when I was employed at Niblibits years ago. The communication that therefore responds to me being physically well, mentally well, emotionally well, right? And I remember I discussed in the year 2024 the 40-hour work week in calculation to the 7 days a week, right? The 40-hour calculation for office employees or for business offices that operates during 9 till 8 p.m., 9 a.m. in the morning till 8 p.m. in the evening, 8 p.m. in the morning till 9 p.m. in the evening, the calculation responsibility that then calculates and equalizes to 5 days a week, right? Out of the 7 day that we acknowledge that under the Genesis 1 verse 7 biblical acknowledgement, the communications that we work with that are the star communications that we are introduced to in American television, including the under the seas communications, including all that were built on earth, right? Genesis 1 verse 7 introduces all communications that as human beings we are acknowledged at, right? When we were then, therefore, in the 40-hour work week, I remember how physically, mentally, emotionally, I was connected to the fact that the work week for me was mentally exhausting my Monday while I was still at office on a Friday, right? Mentally on a Monday, I could feel the effect of the office employment communication that I completed on a Friday, right? And I remember our Friday offices at certain businesses always used to try their best to close the communication line early so that on a Monday the communication line can connect, and so that the computerized communication can connect, and so that there's no computerized errors in the offices, and so that all communications are in acknowledgement to the business communication, right? To the business employment office, right? And I remember how mentally it affected me, realizing that on the Monday the communication line felt so incomplete that I completed so thoroughly on a Friday. I remember always educating myself then to complete my communication on a Thursday, my working week on a Thursday, to completely acknowledge all that I want to do the next week on a Thursday afternoon while it's quiet in the office, while it's 3 p.m., so that on a Monday I don't still feel like I'm sitting in the office in a new working week, but still feel like I'm in the previous working week, right? Because it can mentally affect you if you don't educate yourself how to calculate your office working week in a way that are mentally, physically, emotionally in acknowledgement to the 7 days a week, 4-day calculation in the 40-hour per week calculation salary rate, right? When they calculate our salary rates on 40 hours a week, the calculation in 7 days a week, out of the 40-hour week are then 4 days a week calculation, right? Are then employment week for a employee in the office should then therefore be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? On a Friday, all employment officers have the open negotiation to then still operate in business office hours, but then therefore the weekend are then calculated the Friday, Saturday, Sunday calculation. The off day then therefore the Friday, Saturday, Sunday calculation. And therefore all officers have had the responsibility to really think what I educated about the calculation in the year 2024 when I educated about the 40-hour working week calculation that affects us so mentally when we think about it in a 5-day working week calculation, right? And then it's not only thinking about it on a 5-day working week calculation, but it's an acknowledgement to the 7 days a week calculation that the Friday forms part of the weekend calculation, that your week ends on the Friday, but acknowledging the Friday that are the weekend that we then celebrate and that we then therefore have the days off, right? And that's the 3 days off, 4 days on working week, right? 3 days off, 4 days on working week. Genesis 1 verse 7, 3 calculations. The star communications, Genesis 1 verse 7 calculates the star communications. The Chinese biblical explanation in Genesis 1 verse 7 educates the star calculation. It educates the under the seas calculation. It educates all that were built on the earth calculation. The 3 days off calculation are then Genesis 1 verse 7, and the 7-day, the off-day calculation, it includes then therefore the Friday, right? And when officers do it right in our 100 years, right? Let's say officers get it right to implement the calculation in a way that are mentally, physically, emotionally fair. When I calculated 97.3 calculation, that countries find themselves mentally so unwell at, so much poverty, so much oppression, so much aggressions, only because of the 3-day calculation that should then therefore be the off weekend calculation, while the off weekend calculation are only a 2-day calculation in our years, right? The 97.3-day calculation in acknowledgement to the biblical Genesis 1 verse 7 and the 7-day off calculation. While we have a mentally, emotional communication that mentally, emotionally have us communicated in ways that we physically address the discussion, that we feel physically tired because of the long working week that are so extensive when it's a 2-day off, 5 days on a working week, and that sometimes can so physically exhaust us and it can oppress us physically. We therefore then have a responsibility to acknowledge the 100% calculation that all officers have a responsibility to acknowledge how well countries can then be feeling under the communication line. There are computerized officers, there are computers that can communicate to a human brain, there are computers that can control a human being, like American television educates. Genesis 1 verse 7 will educate, like American television, star communications educate, that the computer have so much control over the human being that such a little calculation that are the 97.3 mentally unwell calculation in our years can have such a physical effect on our human bodies. And I can say that in these years I've been feeling the effect that it has on a human being, the effect that it has on me, just to think of how hard I was working over these years, right? Just to think about all the times that I thought about the Friday communication, all the times that my human brain communicated to me while I was employed at the offices about the Friday of communication, right? All the times that I felt exhausted on a Friday, all the times that I got to the office on a Monday, then when I was not even yet ready to be at the office on the Monday because the Friday calculation was not communicated through thoroughly, right? And when I prepared my Friday calculation on a Thursday and I communicated to myself on a computer and I wrote down all that I want to do the next Monday, all that I do not want a lot of work on the next Monday, all that my Tuesday working week then begins for me on a Tuesday, and I educated my human brain how to feel physically, mentally, emotionally well under the computerized calculation office, that you can feel the tension on your human brain when it calculates in such communication errors that the communication sometimes exhausts and makes you feel tired while you only think about your next week working week, right? And I remember when I was on a Thursday completing my working week, we're preparing my next week working week, then on a Friday I could feel how refreshed I feel, because then the Thursday were for me the working week were complete, and when I felt relaxed in the office on a Friday, then I didn't feel the pressure and the tension of the computerized communication that can sometimes affect us so much in our daily lives, right? That can sometimes have so much control over our daily reactions. And I remember how I closed the communication in a way that was fine for me on a Thursday. How I always prepared a Thursday spreadsheet so that I realized what I want to do the next week, so that the complete working week doesn't echo in my brain the 40-hour, 5-day working week in a 7-day calculation office, right? A calculation office that acknowledges you, the human being, that I acknowledge under the 7 days a week that we have being human beings in the Genesis 1 office communication responsibility, the Monday till a Sunday, that our responsibility to acknowledge that we are not only human beings in this universe, but we are so much intertwined with the computerized star communications as well. And when we educate us in a way that are mentally well, physically well, emotionally well, then the complete communication acknowledges you, to acknowledge you being well on your journey, right? In like Genesis 1 and the 7-day, right? Then it prospers at so much, it creates so much around us, it builds so much around us, it makes us feel so well, only because we then educate ourselves to be physically well under the communication of a stance, and right? And when we therefore refer to the 50% poverty, the 50% provided for calculation offers under the calculation that countries are these years calculated at, right? Then it equalizes to the 100% mentally well communication offers that countries in these years have a responsibility to realize that the computer offers have a responsibility to make us human beings feel 100% well, right? Under the same office that the communication are building, and that the communication can sometimes pressure a human body, right? Only because we then have a responsibility to acknowledge both people that are under the first world, third world country acknowledgement, rather than referring only to the 50% poverty, 50% provided for people, because we don't want people to stay in 50% poverty, but we want all people to feel in the 50% acknowledgement communication office that I acknowledge under the 100% communication office that in me, Queen Ribea Elise's years, my brother Jacques are now 50 years old, right? So we then therefore have 50 years before us, right? In the calculation that we are doing are only calculated until the 50-year calculation that our generation are now in these 100 years for, in this year 2026, right? Finding ourselves in year 2025, that we are now 50 years under the communication, right? The communication then makes way for 50 more years, and it then forms part of the 100% wealth calculation, right? The 50% poverty calculation, 50% provided for calculation are then 50% communication offers that people find themselves at, where they do not have the complete 100% computerized communication that they built offers under, but they have 50% communication part of it, and the countries that are in first world countries' communication lines are then the plus 50 communication in our 50 years, and it equalizes then to a calculation of 100% mentally well in our 50 years, right? So we have a responsibility in these 50 years to feel 100% well. We are under calculation that are 97.3% well. The people that finds themselves under the first world country calculation are 90% well people, right? Countries that find themselves 90% well under the computerized communication that allows all countries to be 100% mentally well. The countries that find themselves under the 7.3% well are countries today that are in poverty, countries today that still yet have had to have their complete 50% well, and the first world countries have had to have their 50% well, and it would then equalize to 100% well mental state that countries find themselves in, right? And because the 7.3% calculation calculates the amount of computerized communications that countries in poverty does not have, right? The amount of business office communications that countries in poverty does not feel the strain of the computerized pressure that the office communication can sometimes hold, right? Of the computerized communication office that are acknowledging so much in the universe that countries that find themselves in the 7.3% calculation are countries that fall short, right? Countries that fall short only because they don't have the computerized communication office that have the acknowledgement that we call the green tick, red tick, right? The red tick today are the fact that the poverty countries are in the 7.3 communication office, that they are mentally, physically, emotionally unwell because of their poverty state. Not yet only because of their poverty state, but because they don't have the computerized office signal that gives them the green tick, and they don't have the complete computerized office signal that gives them the green tick that acknowledges the complete 100% communication office that we are mentally calculated under when we scientifically calculate humanity's well communication line that we are introduced to when we give birth to babies in hospitals, and when we attend to hospital communications, and we learn that it's computerized communications, and all countries therefore have the hospitalized communication, and countries therefore that are not calculated under the 100% well calculation are countries then that fall short. So they don't only, poverty countries don't only fall short because they don't plant and they don't invest in agriculture and in farming in their own countries, but they fall short under the calculation 97.3, under the 90, they fall 90% short, and they feel 90% unwell, right? Only because they don't have the communication activation that are acknowledged in Genesis 1. In Genesis 1 includes all communications, the computerized communication that calculates 90% that the first world countries are feeling 90% in the calculation state that are mentally, physically, emotionally well. They feel 90% well under the calculation only because they have the computerized calculation that are the star calculation. Countries that does not have the star calculation in these 100 years really fall short. And I have learned from experience based on the offices that I have been employed at, based on the employees that was employed at the offices, and I do my calculation estimating the state that Africa, the state that many countries in this day find themselves at based on the falling short calculation, right? When countries get into the communication office that acknowledge and that calculates physically wellness, then they won't fall short in accordance to legislation, right? They fall short in accordance to legislation because they legislatively have a responsibility to acknowledge the communication line, and a lot of countries have not acknowledged the communication line, right? That are for us the mental wellness communication line, the mental wellness telephone line, the hospital communication line that are built in most of the countries, right? When countries fall short under the hospital communication line, then countries are actually falling short under the mental wellness calculator that are on a computerized scientific calculational journey that calculates all countries at, right? There's not a country under government office that today are not calculated under the calculation that are the mental wellness calculation at. When we look at the mental wellness calculation at today and we want to update what me, Ribea Elise, or what me, Queen Ribea Elise, are educating today, then it's the 97.3% calculation, right, that all countries have to feel physically right? And today, half countries find themselves 90% well because they fall under the doctor's calculation, right, that the doctors calculate at based on the offices that were built in countries that does not have the same offices. Today fall short and they feel physically tired and they do not get the same communication and they do not get the international communication that sometimes communicates through computerized communications, that how we human beings communicate human to human, then the computer today also intercommunicate with us human beings in the same communication of us. So today it's not only anymore human beings communicating to human beings, no, but the human communication on a cell phone media page are computerized communication that communicates and intertwine with you, the human being. And countries that does not have the communication line today fall short and finds themselves so physically tired, so present, only because they fall not only short with the 40%, no, but first world countries are 90% today under the calculation of us mentally are 90% well today, while poverty countries are 7.3% well, right? So poverty countries does not only today find themselves 40% falling short in the calculation, but they find themselves today 50+% falling short on the communication line when we calculate the complete 100-year calculation, acknowledging our grandparents that are still on the earth, right? So when we as young children are today 50 years old and we do the 50-50 calculation that equalizes to the 100% calculation in our mid-year that we have walked in our journey, then we acknowledge us, the children in our journey womb. When we acknowledge the complete 100% mentally well calculation that all people have to feel 100% fit, 100% well on a daily basis, right? Then we acknowledge the complete 100-year journey communication line. When we acknowledge under the 50%, then we acknowledge only in the years that we have walked under the computer, acknowledging the computerized communication that we have also walked under, right? And we then also only then therefore acknowledge the 50% communication line, explaining my 4-0 journey book that says that the Bible says until this far we have walked the journey, until this 50 years old. How does my brother King Jacques' New Year's resolution January 2023 says, until this far we have walked the journey's communication line, and the communication line should still keep us another 50 years, and we already a generation of people that feel so tired, so aggressed, so oppressed sometimes under the communication line that must still keep us another 50 years. And we therefore today acknowledge the complete 100% mentally well calculation when we talk about the 50-year journey that we have now already walked under the communication, right? We explain a few different things when we talk about the 50% poverty, 50% provided for group in the calculation that are the 100% mentally well calculation as well as the 100% provided for calculation. It's the same computerized calculation under the Mental Wellness Office Act, and therefore according to me, Queen Ribea Elise's human resource journey, it should be the same calculation under the 100% calculation Act, but it therefore then differentiate in accordance to the years that we have walked the journey in accordance to the response that countries have been responding in the communication line, explaining an example. First world countries have had the complete build of the communication line. Third world countries didn't have the complete computerized build. That we are mentally calculated and communicate on that we communicate today on cell phone media. And while all countries have different communication acknowledgements, we then therefore have a responsibility to acknowledge all different communication lines that calculates how mentally well our generation of people in these 100 years find themselves at, how mentally well our people on earth find themselves in these 100 years at, right? So I've mentioned a lot of things. We have a lot to think about. We have to do the difference calculations. We cannot acknowledge the 50% poverty, 50% provided for calculation only under poverty calculation. No, the poverty calculation are how mentally well our people are on earth. So the 50% plus 50% provided for calculation acknowledges and equalizes then therefore to the 100% mentally well calculation office. And that's why we refer to the 50% poverty, 50% provided for group when we talk about the mental wellness calculation at today. We then also refer to the 100% calculation, acknowledging the 100-year journey that we walk, acknowledging the 100% mentally well, 100% mentally well in all countries calculation that then equalizes to 100% mentally well, right? 100.100 equalizes to 100% mentally well calculation. What I've also then mentioned today, Ed, then also therefore the 97 calculation that are calculated in accordance to the 50 years that I have walked the communication line. For me, I'm 42 years old. My brother King Jacques mentioned in January 2023 on Facebook, he's 50 years old and he didn't mention it. He was just standing with his New Year's resolution feast with a baby on his arm in the currentness of our years that the calculation calculates us in 50 years, and we have a good time in the communication line, then we have a right to be feeling physically well also while we are having a good time in the communication line, right? And while the communication line acknowledges three different communication calculations, it acknowledges the 100.100 equalized to 100% mentally well calculation. It acknowledges the 50% for poverty, the 50% provided for calculation that equalizes to the 100% calculation line, that all countries have a right to feel 100% well, no matter their circumstances, no matter if they are in poverty circumstances, they have a right to feel 100% well and to have a green tick under the Computerized Communication Act. And we then also refer to the 97.3 calculation line that are the currentness of our years that the calculation communication have calculated at, right? That are the currentness of how well countries find themselves at in these 100 years. What are then therefore the reasons that countries don't find themselves well at? They might fall short based on the computerized communication that are not acknowledging their country's business office communications at. While they feel physically fine, then they have to activate, like we say on mindset control over attitude, we then activate by educating ourselves to feel and to react physically well no matter our circumstances, right? So countries can plant and invest and they can build further in the communication line, or they can go on in a way that they don't acknowledge the complete computerized communication line that first world countries acknowledge, and that the economy today are being calculated at financially. We call it the finances in our bank account, right? So what we are talking about are also the finance computerized bank, the bank card in our hands, the credit card in our hands are also the calculation computerized office that not all countries are acknowledged at in this day, right? And when countries fall short in the communication, then they have a right to educate themselves mentally, physically, emotionally well, and they have a right to react in a way that are then therefore in acknowledgement to the green tick that acknowledges the complete computerized communication line that acknowledges all different countries, right? So let's say it again, the computerized communication and 100% mentally well should then therefore acknowledge all different countries, right? It shouldn't only acknowledge a New Zealand, no, it should acknowledge Egypt, it should acknowledge Sudan in this day, it should acknowledge Ethiopia in this day, it should acknowledge Ghana in this day. It should not only be a computerized office that drives a vehicle in New Zealand and that our business computer in the New Zealand office, no, but it's a computerized communication that acknowledge all the different countries that forms part of the communication that New Zealand are building on, right? So let's say an example, even though Ghana today are not built like New Zealand are built today, then Ghana are still acknowledged under the same communication that are the mental wellness communication that New Zealand are built on. And when Ghana are acknowledged in the same communication line, then Ghana have a responsibility to have a green tick, right? To feel mentally well in the same communication line that today in Ghana are only a hospital communication line, right? And when the hospital communication line calculates the country in a green tick, that the country's people are mentally well, physically well, emotionally well, then Ghana then forms part of the 90% countries that feels mentally, physically, emotionally well under the communication line that are not only computerized, but it includes us human beings. How we communicate being human beings, the computer today forms part of the communication line that we human beings are acknowledged at. And only because of that, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves on these scientific calculations. I remember I've mentioned earlier in the previous video that my brother King Martin are born. Science in all God's glory. My brother King Richard are born. Scientific science in all acknowledgement. Science, the scientific journey that the families have walked, as well as the scientific part of our womb that were born in these 100 years, in all acknowledgement, in all that were built and that were discovered in the universe. Brother King Zak are born logical scientific science, logically in the journey that families were walking over the years, in acknowledgement to the scientific journeys that our families were walking, in acknowledgement to the scientific experiences that our families had while they were walking the journeys, right? Logical scientific science. King Anton then born in scientific logical science, right? Science in all that were implemented on earth, logically in how families walk the journey, scientifically in all that science exists in the universe, right? And when we talk about the four kings in their thrones today, and we say King Martin in all acknowledgement that science are, in all that we have learned, that we are wombed in our years, and that the womb Queen Mom Universe and a George Throne womb are born in South Africa in our 100 years, then it's an acknowledgement to all the experiences that the womb have had over the years, whether we experienced it, whether our ancestors experienced it. It's acknowledged in our birth homes, it's acknowledged in all that has been discovered, it's acknowledged in the computerized communication that acknowledges our households, and therefore we have to then therefore acknowledge how our families are wombed in these years, so that the communication can sometimes not be so harsh on us, not be so mentally harsh on us, so that we can also feel well in all that we educate ourselves to feel well about, right? And that is where we want to be at with today's discussion. I realize I've mentioned a lot. Listen completely. I'm going to rephrase on the very same video that we have made today, and I'm going to refer only to specific topics that I've discussed in today's video. our 97.3% under the biblical calculation, that are the 10% calculation, that are the 1 plus 1 digit, right? The 9 plus the 7 digit, right? The 9 digit in acknowledgement to the fact that we are human beings on earth, the 7 digit in acknowledgement to the fact that we are human beings, right? That we are talking about two different human beings that find themselves in different circumstances on earth, the 90% first world country nationality people, the 7% nationality people that find themselves in different parts of the earth, right? And while we are calculating under the Calculation Act, we are then therefore having a responsibility to acknowledge the Human Right Act, right? When we calculate under the Calculation Act, we have a right to acknowledge the Human Right Act. When we calculate today in the fact that the Calculation Act activates the 9% under the biblical acknowledgement, that are the 10% tax calculation that calculates how mentally well we feel and how mentally overtired we were, our office working communication line has been, then it's the same act that calculates the 7.3%. It's individual acts only because based on how countries are built today, based on how countries hold business under the office communication line, but the 90 plus the 7% are today the 1 plus 1 office communication calculation line that the Bible talks about, the tax collector that oppresses the communication line on earth, and that people feel oppressed and tired about, and that people are in wars about, only because the calculation has to be activated and it has to include all different countries' responsibilities, right? To mentally be acknowledged under the Computerized Calculation Act that we are mentally acknowledging in hospitals, right? And only because we can listen to this video again, because we have a right to acknowledge all that we are saying in the video, we will rephrase on all that we are educating in this week's video. We have mentioned it on our LinkedIn page with me, Ribea Elise. I've mentioned the Tax Calculation Act that therefore calculates the mental wellness, that therefore are acknowledged in business offices today, that has a responsibility to submit the calculation of how mentally well employees at the office are, and it therefore equalizes to the Hospitalized Calculation Act that calculates how mentally well families are at. And I'm only talking about experience because my mama was employed at hospital. Me, Ribea Elise, walked the journey in acknowledgement. I was human resource, health and safety officer, manager at Nibblebit's office in South Africa, and I therefore acknowledge the complete communication line when I educate on mindset control over attitude. That's all that I want to say in this video, that I want to educate us, that I feel the right to educate at in this week's video, that are our mindset control over attitude, our mindset control over attitude, the 100% calculation that calculates us being responsible when we are 100% mentally well under the Calculation Act that calculates our mental wellness while we walk our 100 years on earth. Biblical 100 years of utmost importance to me, and that is why I'm sharing my mental wellness education, and that's why I'm educating my mental wellness education, only because biblically acknowledging all that we have learned in our 100 years, all that we have been educated, all that we have to acknowledge about our 100 years, we then have a right, and I then have a right to educate my mental wellness mentorship education in how I feel right and fine at. And that's where we are at today with me, Queen Ribea Elise, mindset control over attitude, mindset 100%, your control 100% over yourself, your attitude then 100% in calculation, mindset control over attitude, and therefore 100% calculation act. And that's where we are at with our Mental Wellness Calculation Act education this week, the year 2025-2026 calculation that educates us to be physically well, mentally well, emotionally well in all that we do. That is it. Have a great, great day.